Cloud Business Apps and SharePoint Workflows. I'm Michael Washington. You can get my books on the LightSwitch helpwebsite.com. For our agenda today, we'll first cover what are SharePoint Workflows. We'll then cover what is Visual Studio LightSwitch. We'll show an end-to-end LightSwitch SharePoint workflow application. We will then enhance that application to create an advanced SharePoint workflow using HTTP calls to LightSwitch. First, what are SharePoint workflows? SharePoint workflows in SharePoint Server 2013 communicate with SharePoint Server through the Workflow Manager. This diagram shows a simple workflow. A document is created and then assigned to a reviewer. A reviewer can reject or approve the document, and it will change the status of the document. Tools to create workflows. You can use Visio, the SharePoint Designer, which will be demonstrated in this presentation, or Visual Studio. What is Visual Studio LightSwitch? Visual Studio LightSwitch allows you to create HTML applications. It creates single-page SPA applications using jQuery Mobile. It implements an AngularJS-style JavaScript binding framework, and it communicates with the back-end services using OData. Now, why would you want to use SharePoint Workflows with LightSwitch? The primary reason is you need to have custom forms to gather data. Also, you may need to implement various permissions for your business data. Also, you may need to integrate your workflow with other data sources. LightSwitch allows you to easily connect to outside data sources. We will now demonstrate an end-to-end LightSwitch SharePoint workflow application. We'll log into SharePoint and select Site Contents. We will then scroll down until we go to the Vacation Request List application. We'll see existing vacation requests. We'll click New Item to create a new vacation request. We'll give it a title. In our first example, we'll request a vacation that is more than 7 days away. We'll save it. The workflow will start, and we'll see that the vacation is automatically approved. Next, we'll create a new vacation request. This time, the vacation request will be for less than 7 days away. When we check our email, we'll see that the vacation approvers have been sent an email and they will be requested to approve the vacation. When they click the link, it'll take them to the LightSwitch application. The LightSwitch application will show the vacation request. The approvers can click on the vacation request and then check the approval status. In this case, they'll approve it and then click Save. The vacation has been approved. We will now create the application. We will first create a SharePoint list. We will then create the SharePoint workflow. Next, we'll create the LightSwitch Cloud Business Application. A Cloud Business Application is a LightSwitch application that runs on SharePoint. First, we'll create the SharePoint list. We'll log into SharePoint as an administrator and select the Add an App. We'll select the Custom List application, which is used to create custom lists. We'll create a custom list called the Vacation Request List. After the list is created, we will go into Settings, and we'll go to Create Column, and we'll create some additional columns. We'll create a calculated column that will show approval status. We will also go into Advanced Settings, allow management of content types, and then under Content Types we'll go into Items so that we can hide certain fields. We'll also go to All Items, and then we will hide the approval status field because the approval status display will be used to show the status of the workflow item. Let's look at this in SharePoint. We'll go to Site Contents. We'll select Add an App. The app we'll add will be the custom list app. We'll indicate that our custom list will be called Vacation Request List. It will then show up, and we can go into settings so we can customize it. Here we're going to add a couple of custom columns. The first column that we'll add will be called Approval Status. This will be a number, and it will be defaulted at 0. We actually won't show this. We'll actually use a approval status display, which is a calculated field, which will actually point to the approval status. However, we will then use a formula so that we can display the words approved or not approved based on the status number. We will then create an end date column, and we'll set it to be a date time field. We'll also create a start date, which will also be a date time field. We'll then go to Advanced Settings, and we'll select Allow Management of Content Types. We do this so that we now have the option to hide and change the display order of certain fields. In this case, we'll hide the approval status field so that only the approval status display field will be shown. We'll also set certain fields to be required. In this case, the end date field and the start date field. Also, lists have multiple views. In this case, we'll go into the view and we'll again set the approval status field to not be shown, and we'll reorder some of the fields. Now, when we create a new item, the form will show. We will now create the SharePoint workflow. We will go into the SharePoint Designer and select Lists and Libraries, and we'll then select the Vacation Request List. We will then click the List Workflow button, and we will create the workflow, ensuring that we're using SharePoint 2013 workflows. We will then be in the Designer for the workflow. We will create an Add Time to Date property, which will create a variable called 7 days from now. We'll set it to look at the current date and create the 7 days from now. 7 days from now will be set to be 7 days from today. Next, we will create a if value equals value option and set the start date of the current item to be compared to the variable 7 days from now. If it is greater than or equal to 7 days from now, we will set a field in the current item. We'll set the approval status to 1. We can also set logging. We will also then send an email. We'll send an email to the user to indicate that their vacation request has been approved. This picture also shows how vacation approvers can also be emailed. The vacation approvers will be emailed if the vacation is not approved. This image shows how we're able to format the email message and customize it using variables that are coming from the current item. We will then set the else branch so that we can email the vacation approvers if the vacation is not approved because the start date is less than 7 days from now. This shows the completed workflow. We will then go back to the vacation request list and set it to start the workflow when an item is added to the vacation request list. We will then click Save and Publish, and the workflow is then ready to go. Let's take a look at this. We open the SharePoint Designer, we select the vacation request list, and then we click the button to add a workflow to the list. We'll call the workflow Vacation Request Workflow. We'll ensure that our platform type is SharePoint 2013. Our workflow will be created. So now let's design it. First, we're going to add an Add Time to Date component. We're going to indicate that we're going to add 7 days to a date. The date will be the current date. We'll then store this value in a variable, and we'll give this variable a name, 7 days from now. This gives you an idea of how workflows are created. You can create variables that have values that you can then compare to values in your current item. We'll now create an if statement where we'll now look at the current item, which is the current vacation request, and we'll select the start date. We're going to say if the start date is greater than or equal to, and now we can select our variable that we created in the earlier step. And we'll select 7 days from now. So, if the start date is greater than or equal to the variable 7 days from now, we want to automatically approve the vacation request. So we want to set the approval status to the value 1, which will be approved. So we select Set Approval Status to 1. This will approve the vacation request. We can also set logging. Logging is useful for debugging. So we simply type log. We'll then be able to add a message, and we can simply say that we set the status to 1. We can also send an email. In this case, we want to send an email to the person who made the request to tell them that their vacation request has been approved. So in the to statement, we can select workflow lookup for a user. What this allows us to do is this allows us to look in the current item, which is the current vacation request, and we can look at the field which represents the current person, the created by. However, we don't want to send the email to their name, we want to send it to their email address. We simply click OK, OK again, and now this email will be sent to the person. We can now format the email with a subject, and in the message we can select fields from the current item so that we can indicate which vacation request this is for. Now we need to do an else statement. This is if the start date is less than 7 days from now. In this case, we want to send an email to the vacation approvers. So we select the email component, and then users, and then the to box. Now in this case, we've created a group called vacation approvers. The email will be sent to them. As before, we can format the message using values from the current item, such as, in this case, the title. We format the message and simply click OK. As before, we can set logging, which will help in debugging. When you're creating a workflow, you have to either terminate the workflow or indicate that you're transitioning to another workflow. In this case, we'll terminate the workflow. We'll now return to the vacation request list, and we'll indicate that this workflow is to start whenever a new item is created, which is a new vacation request. We'll then save the workflow. However, it was not deployed until we click the Publish button. Once we click this, the workflow has been published and it's ready to go. We will now create the LightSwitch Cloud Business application. We will open Visual Studio and select Cloud Business App. It will ask us to log into our SharePoint development site. Under the Server project, we'll select Data Sources and Add Data Source. We will select SharePoint and we will select our development site. We will then create a link to the vacation request list and also the user information list. And the reason we do this is so that LightSwitch can show the username as well as the full name of a user when showing an item. The vacation request list and the user information list will show under data sources in the LightSwitch application. We will then wire up to the validate method. We'll use the following code that will ensure that only vacation approvers can change the status of a vacation request. Also, we'll select approval status, choice list, and create a choice list so that when we have the UI, we can see a nice display name instead of just the numerical value that indicates what the status of the request is. We will then go to the HTML client project and select Add Screen. We'll select the Browse Data screen, and LightSwitch will automatically create the screen. We will then set LightSwitch so that when you click on a vacation request list, it will take you to the edit screen. LightSwitch will automatically create the screen. Normally it will be set to show as dialog. In this case, we'll uncheck the box so that we get the full screen so we have enough room to work with. We will then rearrange the screen and then we'll start debugging. It will prompt us to log into our SharePoint site and then redirect us back into our application. It will then ask us to trust the application, and the application will then run. Let's take a look at this. We'll create a new project in Visual Studio. We'll create a Cloud Business App, which is a LightSwitch application designed to work on SharePoint. It'll ask us to connect to our development SharePoint site, and the application will be created. We'll go to Data Sources and we'll select Add Data Source. We'll then select SharePoint as our data source. We'll then point to our development website. We'll select the user information list and the vacation request list, and they'll be imported into the application. We'll open up the vacation request list and we'll select Write Code. We'll select the validate method, and here we'll add our custom code to ensure that only members of the vacation approvers are able to change the status. Go ahead and save this. Close our excess windows. Now for the approval status, we'll select that field and select Choice List. Here we're going to create the choice list. When we create the screens, we'll automatically get a drop down. Now let's create the screens. We'll go to the HTML client project and select Add Screen. We'll select the Browse Data Screen template and we'll select the vacation request list data source. We'll now go ahead and rearrange some fields here so that we can customize this to be exactly the way we want. Next, we'll make it so that when you select a particular vacation request, it will open up the screen so that we can edit that vacation request. This is so that we can change the status. LightSwitch will ask us to create a new screen. We'll say yes. Normally, An edit screen shows up as a dialog, but we need more room, so we'll go ahead and uncheck that. On the edit screen, we'll go ahead and customize it. Move some fields around. We'll also delete some of the fields that we don't want to show. We will now show an advanced SharePoint workflow using HTTP calls to LightSwitch. Let's look at the application. We'll log into SharePoint and we'll go to the vacation request application. This will take us to the LightSwitch application. This time we'll be able to set the vacation days for each user. In this case, we'll change the user's vacation days to 2. Now, when we return to SharePoint, we'll go to the vacation request application and create a new vacation request. In this case, we'll add a vacation request for a 1-day vacation. When we look in our email, we see the vacation has been automatically approved. Now we'll return to the LightSwitch application, the vacation request application. When we select that user again and look at their days, we see that before it was 2, but now it's been changed to 1. So when the vacation request has been approved, the days are automatically deducted. Now we'll go back to the vacation request list application, create a new vacation request for that same user, this time for more days than they have. Now, as before, the vacation approvers will be sent an email and it'll indicate that they need to approve this vacation. This of course will take them back to the LightSwitch application, and as before they can select the vacation request and change the approval status. In this case, they can go ahead and approve it and then click Save, and the vacation has been approved. We will now create the application. We will first update the LightSwitch application. We will then create a workflow connector. We will then update the workflow. First, to update the LightSwitch application, we're going to add a table directly into the application. This table will be called Vacation Days. We will then select Add Screen, and this time we'll select the common screen set and the Vacation Days table that we just created, and LightSwitch will automatically create the CRUD screens needed. The CRUD screens will show up. We can then run the application, and immediately we'll be able to set vacation days for the various users in the SharePoint site. Let's take a look at that in Visual Studio. We'll go into the server project and we're going to add a table directly to the application. The table will be called Vacation Days. We'll add a property called username. Now the type will be person. This will automatically give us the ability to look into the SharePoint site and select a person. We'll also have a column for the days. Now to create the screen to edit this table, we select Add Screen and we select Common Screen Set. We then select the Vacation Days table, and LightSwitch will automatically create the Create, Read, Update, and Delete screens. At this point, we can actually go ahead and run the application. We will then see a link that will navigate us to the Vacation Days table that we just created, and we can search for and select users in our SharePoint site and set their vacation days. We will now create the workflow connector. On the server project, we'll add a new item and we'll add a generic handler. We will then use this code that when called, a password will be required. The code will then log into the database of the LightSwitch application to see if the user has enough vacation days. If they have enough vacation days, the vacation days are subtracted and the workflow, which will be calling this code, will be told that the vacation has been approved. Otherwise, the workflow will be told that the vacation has not been approved. We'll also need to add a reference to system configuration in the LightSwitch project. We will also update the web config. The reason we're doing this is that normally all calls to the LightSwitch application must be authenticated. However, the workflow will be running outside of SharePoint and will not be authenticated. Now, when it calls the workflow connector, it will need a password. However, in order to even get to the workflow connector, we need to go to the web config and we need to say that the workflow connector will allow anonymous users to call it. However, the password is still required in order for the workflow connector to actually perform the functionality that we just covered.
Let's take a look at that in Visual Studio. So we'll go to the server project and we'll create a generic handler. This generic handler will be called Workflow Connector. This will be called by the workflow. We'll have some references that we'll need to add, system configuration, and web extensions. We'll now put in the code which, when called by the workflow running in SharePoint, if the user has enough days, it'll deduct the days and send back a message that's been approved. Otherwise, it won't be approved. In order to call this workflow connector, a password must be passed. We'll then go into the web config and set it so that anonymous calls can call the workflow connector.
Finally, we'll update the workflow. This is what the current workflow currently looks like. We will change the very first item to make an HTTP call. This will be calling back into the LightSwitch application, calling the workflow connector, passing the password and the other values such as the user, the date that the user is requesting for their vacation request to the workflow connector so that it can check to see if the user has enough vacation days and respond back either that it's been approved and the days have been deducted or it has not been approved. We will then alter the workflow to simply look at the response, and based upon the response it either approves it or it doesn't approve it. So the rest of the code other than the second line will stay the same. If we have Visio installed, we can select the Visual Designer and we can see the workflow in Visio.
Let's go ahead and look at that in the SharePoint Designer. We'll select the workflow. We'll select Edit Workflow. Now, we no longer need that variable 7 days from now, so we'll go ahead and delete it. We're replacing it with an HTTP call to the workflow connector in the LightSwitch application. So we can use lookup fields to set the current values for the current request so that it's passed to the workflow connector so that it can have the information it needs to know whether to approve or deny. The value returned back from the workflow connector is stored in a variable called response code. Based upon the value of that response code, we will approve or we will inform the vacation approvers that they need to approve the workflow.
You can get all the code and a step-by-step blog of this presentation on the LightSwitchHelpWebsite.com. You can also order my books on the LightSwitchHelpWebsite.com.